Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed for another Q&A session. I think a lot of you guys really enjoyed the first Q&A session that we did on this channel, so we're back. We've collated some more questions from primarily our Discord community. So if you're a Hardware Unboxed member on Patreon or Floatplane, you can always ask us questions there in the Discord community there and chat about monitors and all sorts of stuff. But anyway, questions from there, questions from YouTube over at Hardware Unboxed, some questions from Monitors Unboxed in the previous video as well. Lots of really interesting topics dedicated to monitors to get through. So I guess let's get this one underway. First question here is about calibration from our Discord community. If a monitor color calibration / ICC profile is created at a particular brightness setting, how does the color accuracy change if the brightness is changed? It's an interesting question. I think this really depends on the specific type of monitor. Some monitors are more consistent across the brightness range. Others can vary quite a lot. I think what you'll find with most of today's more modern LCD monitors is that you won't see too much of a change between different brightness settings. Generally speaking, you can calibrate at one brightness setting and change it a little bit either way without too much of an impact. But certainly if you're making very large brightness changes, then you should go through the calibration process again just to ensure it's the most accurate. And if you're really concerned about color accuracy, for example, it's professional work or something like that, then really any time that you change your monitor settings, you should be recalibrating it, even if you don't think that there's too much of a difference between the brightnesses. Certainly for when we recommend certain settings to use for monitors or when we're creating our ICC profiles, we always do them at 200 nits, which is the same across every monitor brand. And at times we've messed around changing the brightness settings, which may have a small effect on white balance and those sorts of things. But again, for most people who are more interested in color calibration as a casual user, you're not doing professional work, the differences aren't going to matter that much, certainly unless you've got super professional grade tools and are interested in that. So to be honest, I don't think it's something to be super concerned about, but again, there are some variances there, so it depends. Yogi asks, there's usually a point where spending more gets you diminishing returns. Where would you say that point is with monitors? Does it change if you're looking for 4K versus 1440p, 144Hz versus 240Hz, etc.? I think today still what we've seen across the past couple of years and is still true today is that the sweet spot, so the price to performance ratio, the value point for a lot of gaming monitor purchases is in the 1440p 144Hz market, because today you can still get those monitors for around $300, sometimes as low as $250 US, get some very high quality products there. Whereas to get higher specifications, either in refresh rate or resolution, you tend to have to spend quite a bit more money. So definitely I would say that you're not in the diminishing returns category buying there. I think 1440p is a big upgrade over 1080p and tends to not cost you all that much, maybe $100 US these days. And again, going from say 60Hz to 144Hz is such a massive upgrade that I don't think I could recommend anyone buying 60Hz monitors, especially for gaming today with current prices. As for the main, I guess, meat of this question, talking about like 4K versus 1440p, I think this does differ a fair bit depending on a few categories. I think the size of the monitor makes a big difference for the resolution. If you're at a 27-inch size, I don't think you're going to see too much of a difference from 1440p up to 4K. It tends to be quite subtle. I can personally notice the difference, but other people probably are not going to be able to. Depends how sensitive you are for those sorts of things. So personally for me, I think with 1440p 144Hz priced, as I said, around $300 and 4K priced around like $600 plus US, that's definitely diminishing returns for 4K. I don't think that's really worth it. Yeah, you're really not getting double the sort of perceived resolution. 1440p does look very good at that size. But if you're talking more 32 inches or larger, then I think depending on the products you're comparing, it definitely could be worth going with 4K. Now, it's probably still diminishing returns type stuff, but I think it's easier to justify for those larger sizes. As for refresh rate, this one I've sort of changed my mind on as time's gone on. I think initially when I first started looking at 240Hz displays and these sort of super high refresh rate products for the time, I thought, this isn't going to be too much of a difference over 144Hz. And certainly when you use them for the first time, it tends to not be that noticeable. But I think as you get used to using a higher refresh rate like 240Hz, it makes the older refresh rates, like 144 hertz, feel a lot slower when you go backwards. So I've always found that returning to the lower refresh rate has always been more noticeable for me than going the other way. So it's kind of, it's a difficult one, because I think a lot of people, when they buy a 240 hertz monitor, that's, let's say they've spent, I think for 1440p you might have to spend like $200 more. For 4K, obviously, we're just starting to get those products. And for 1080p, it's probably about the sort of $150, $200 more range. I think for a lot of people, when they first use that, especially if they're coming from 144 hertz, that you're going to feel like you've gotten a diminishing returns type product. Like, oh, that's not too much of an upgrade. But I certainly would think that after using that product for a couple of weeks to a month and then going back to 144 hertz, you'll notice how large of an upgrade it really is. So I think in a lot of cases, 240 hertz probably is worth paying for, or is on the borderline of diminishing returns. Depends on the prices, of course, that we're talking about. But I think that the 240 hertz upgrade is more valuable to people than the 4K upgrade, at least with where things stand today and for normal monitor sizes. And I say that because I think when we go up to 360 hertz in the future, we're starting to see some more 360 hertz monitors right now. There's 500 hertz 1080p on the horizon as well. I think once we move up to those refresh rates, you'll start to really notice how slow 144 hertz feels in comparison. I remember using a 360 hertz monitor and feeling like, whoa, this is actually a big upgrade compared to 144 hertz. So I think there's still a lot of room in that regard for improvements to the motion performance, the smoothness and everything that you're getting there. Whereas I feel with the resolution side of things, it's probably not as noticeable for a lot of people. So yeah, I guess that's my thoughts on that one. To carry on with the 4K questions, what configurations and settings do you recommend for HDR gaming, particularly with an OLED, both OS and the display? Well, I guess when it comes to display settings, it's kind of hard to sort of say exactly what settings you should use, because it is going to vary a lot between each monitor. I tend to find that most monitors these days have a couple of different HDR modes, and you'll need to dial in which mode is the most accurate in a lot of instances. Whether we're talking like LGC2, you're probably going to need to change into one of the ISF modes, or potentially filmmaker mode, depending on what you're doing, and maybe changing around white balance and a few things there. If you've got the Alienware AW3423DW, there's a few settings differences between the HDR 400 and the 1000 modes. That it depends exactly what you're looking for with HDR. So for the displays, case by case basis, typically speaking, but again, there usually is one mode that's the most usable there. I think for Windows, again, it really depends, because there's a lot of different ways to go about HDR gaming. Some people like to have HDR enabled in Windows for everything and then also enable it in games. Some people like to have it disabled in Windows and then enable it on a case-by-case basis for the games that they use. I don't think there's really a right or wrong answer there. I think there's some good auto HDR utilities as well. And I don't mean the Windows 11 auto turning games into HDR utility. I mean things that will turn on HDR in Windows, as in turn it on or off, depending on what games you're playing. I can't quite remember the exact name of the utility. I know there's one out there that will do this for you, and I think that's probably how I'd recommend most people go about it, because monitors are most likely going to handle SDR better in their SDR mode. So if you're trying to run SDR windows, like for YouTube videos or whatever, in the HDR mode, then being tone mapped to HDR on your monitor, I think that's generally speaking worse than just running in the SDR mode. I know Windows 11's made some strides in that direction, but I still think that's probably the best way of going about it, especially if you've got like an LG OLED that does a really good job of giving you calibration settings for HDR and SDR that you can deal with. So yeah, I guess that's probably what I'd recommend doing. And then obviously if you have an OLED, you should probably also consider doing things like changing your settings to dark mode, minimizing the taskbar, and running a screensaver as well. Don't really recommend that for LCD stuff, it's not really necessary. But if you've got an OLED, I'd probably recommend enabling all those things as well if you're doing a lot of desktop use. If RGB is considered a standard subpixel layout, why do panel manufacturers use non-standard layouts like BGR and risk impacting text clarity? Am I right in understanding that subpixel layout would not matter for dynamic content, just text or static elements? So I'll just add the second part of this question first about the text and static elements versus dynamic content. So dynamic content being like games, movies, that sort of thing. The reason why subpixel layout doesn't really matter too much for dynamic content is that you're not seeing harsh, hard contrast edges. So typically what your operating system will do with high contrast edges like text or windows or the edges of different elements to the UI is that they'll make use of something called subpixel rendering, which kind of cheats the system a little bit. I'm not sure whether calling it a cheat is fair, but basically they're taking advantage of the fact that your monitor isn't actually just the pixels themselves. There's actually 3 subpixels for each pixel. So if you optimize the way that you're handling those subpixels, you can get a higher perceived resolution than if you were just dealing with the fact that you had a certain number of pixels. So on something like a 1080p monitor, you can get sort of higher than what should be 1080p text clarity by using subpixel text rendering. But subpixel text rendering takes advantage of knowing the exact layout of the subpixels, so the exact dimensions that they're going to be, the order and everything, which makes that a really key point of how a monitor has to be set up. And any changes from the way that those arrangements are means that you're going to see that reduction in text clarity because it's expecting a certain subpixel layout to sort of cheat the system a little bit, and it's getting something different. So if anything, it can actually make the image look worse than if subpixel text rendering wasn't used, or at least less optimal. So yeah, it's not as important for dynamic content because you're not going to see as many of those harsh, high contrast edges. And people who are making movies and TV shows and games are not really thinking too much about cheating and using subpixel rendering to get higher clarity. If anything, it's very rare to get a really nice, crisp, clean, like 4K presentation because they're going to do all sorts of artistic style things, maybe soften it up a bit or over sharpen it. It depends on what they're looking for there. So yeah, I don't think the subpixel layout matters too much if you're playing games, watching movies, YouTube videos, that sort of thing. It's not really too much of a consideration. As for why panel manufacturers use non-standard layouts, the main reason we see BGR versus RGB has to do with the positioning of the scaler and other hardware elements that are attached directly to the panel. So when a panel is produced at the factory, it's not just a panel with wires coming out. Generally speaking, they've also got a bit of a processing hardware there, maybe something like the T-Con, maybe some other controllers that are attached directly to the panel, so that when you're integrating that into the monitor itself, you can hook it up without having to deal with all those sorts of things, and it's just a nice, more integrated package. So with most RGB monitors and almost every single panel, we'll put that hardware at the bottom, which is why you'll tend to see monitors with thinner bezels around the left and right sides and the top, and then a bit of a thicker bezel at the bottom. That might be because that panel has 3 nice, really thin, bezel borders, and then the bottom bezel is kind of a little bit thickened because of some of those processing elements. With the BGR stuff, for some reason, some panel manufacturers have decided to put the processing hardware at the top. So if you've got a standard RGB layout and you've got the processing hardware at the top, you run into this issue where for most monitors where you have the hardware at the bottom and then they've made a panel where the hardware's at the top, you have to flip the panel 180 degrees, which gives you this sort of BGR subpixel layout in addition to the RGB type stuff. But then again, sometimes the scan out is still top to bottom with the hardware at the bottom for a BGR panel. So again, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think there's probably maybe there was some customer that particularly requested for a bulk order of that panel that the hardware was at the top, or I'm sure there's some reason that panel manufacturers have decided to do that. But I think most panel manufacturers do try and stick to RGB where possible. I'm assuming there's just some limitation there for the BGR stuff. For the OLED stuff, it does differ again because things like RGBW for LG OLEDs, they've added the white subpixel in there to boost brightness for things like white content. It just helps a little bit with the stress and strain on all the different subpixels for OLED. Triangle RGB as well seems to have its benefits for some certain types of content and just seems to be maybe an easier way to manufacture that panel. Depends on the type of manufacturing process that they're using for OLEDs. That can differ substantially between what types of things you can do with the layout of the pixels and everything. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of reasons why they tend to do this. I don't think it's necessarily just we don't know what we're doing sort of thing. There's definitely some technical limitations there as to why they don't do it. But again, we see most panels using RGB because it does make the most sense and is the most compatible type of format. So that's what most manufacturers try and go for. At what point do you think backlight zones will be enough to be indistinguishable from self-lit pixel tech like OLED for the bloom? It's an interesting question. I don't think we're there yet with 1,000 zones. I think that's pretty clear. I think probably by the time this video comes out or shortly afterwards, we'll be comparing OLED to 1,000 zones directly. And while 1,000 zones can get close, you definitely will still see blooming in some circumstances that an OLED doesn't really have. So 1,000 zones doesn't really cut it. I've used the 10,000 zones of the MacBook Pro, the mini LED laptop display there, and 10,000 zones does look very good. So I think once we start to get around there, it's definitely going to close the gap substantially to OLED. I don't think it will be indistinguishable. You can still notice some blooming on the 10,000 zones of that MacBook Pro display, but it looks really good, and in most circumstances, it's very hard to notice that there is actually a mini LED backlight going on there. Beyond that, obviously, I think maybe another order of magnitudes, like 100,000 zones, is probably going to be very, very challenging to spot the difference between there, because then going from 100,000 zones to like 8 million zones, I think is probably very much a diminishing returns type situation there, especially if you're pairing it with a really strong VA technology. So yeah, I think around there, I think around 10,000 zones, maybe as much as 100,000 zones will really close the gap to OLED. And then obviously we've got the micro LED technology coming whenever that's supposed to be happening. It isn't quite a thing yet, unfortunately, for realistic panel sizes. But yeah, I think that within the next couple of years, we'll probably start to see more 10,000 zone backlight examples, which will give us some really nice HDR quality and potentially be something to choose over OLED, because it will potentially have benefits for brightness, burn-in, maybe some pixel layout type stuff. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. Is there any difference in panel performance from using different cables? Are fancier cables better? What about the length of the cable? So the panel performance in terms of things like response times, color performance, that sort of thing is not going to differ from the different cables, because we're talking about a digital signal. So that might have been the case back when we're talking about analog type stuff, but certainly in the digital era, it's more of a case of whether the monitor works or doesn't work. So it's not really going to affect most of the areas of panel performance that you'd be thinking of. Fancier cables, better quality cables can help with things like artifacting on the screen. So maybe you'll see some lines running across the screen from time to time, or maybe the panel will black out from time to time or flicker, or not be able to run at the highest refresh rate as stably with lower quality cables, and it can help to buy a higher quality cable to mitigate those issues. But in terms of, again, the main areas of panel performance, I don't think that's going to be an issue. The length of cable does matter as well. So again, not for the panel performance stuff, but more for the stability, the flickering performance, those sorts of things. I think it does matter to get a high quality cable the longer that you go. So for things like HDMI cables, I've got some crappy 5-meter cables that don't work displaying things like 4K 60 Hertz very stably, and then some better quality cables that definitely are more stable. Same with DisplayPort cables. I've seen monitors where using a low quality cable, maybe that monitor flickers, whereas using a high quality cable, the monitor doesn't flicker, which again, that means it's no longer the fault of the monitor, it's more a fault of the cable. So yeah, investing in good quality cables I think is important, but don't go crazy buying those like $1,000 monster cables or $200 cables. Something that's a bit cheaper than that I think is going to be perfectly fine for your use cases. Radeon 7000 has been confirmed to have DisplayPort 2.0 support, and presumably RTX 4000 will as well. How soon do you think we'll see DisplayPort 2.0 monitors hit the market? I don't think there's any real pressure to see DisplayPort 2.0 on the market. We've seen already that DisplayPort with DSC and also HDMI 2.1 with DSC, so display stream compression, is perfectly fine for most of the monitor technologies that we've got today. So the Odyssey Neo G8, for example, is a 4K 240Hz display, so huge bandwidth requirements there. And that works fine with DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC and also HDMI 2.1 with DSC to handle that bandwidth requirement. So for DisplayPort 2.0, we're really going to start talking about like, when is DisplayPort plus DSC or HDMI plus DSC insufficient for that bandwidth? Like, are we having to compress the display signal too much and it's not going to be sufficient? I think for that, we're really talking about like high refresh rate 8K displays, maybe even pushing 4K beyond 240 Hz. That's really where DisplayPort 2.0, I think, is going to come to be of significant benefit. It also is going to be a factor, at least for these GPUs, as to what specific DisplayPort 2.0 bandwidth they're supporting. I believe there's two different variants. You've got UHBR, I'll put that on the screen, the exact proper acronym: ultra high bandwidth 40 and 80 gigabits per second, I believe, are the two stands for DisplayPort. Yeah, those first GPUs, they may only support, say, the 40 gigabits per second standard rather than the 80 gigabits per second standard, so there may be a bit of confusion there. We'll just have to wait and see how all that stuff plays out, but I don't think it's really required at the moment, so I don't think there'll be this big push to support DisplayPort 2.0 anytime soon. Which type of monitor power supply unit, internal using the same plug as a PC PSU or external brick with some sort of barrel plug, are you preferring and why? I think with this question, there's kind of I guess there's pros and cons of each way of doing it. I personally prefer the internal power supply. The reasons for that being that I think it's easier if you have just cables lying around. You can very easily plug it in with your existing cables. You can find cables that are very sufficiently long enough. A lot of monitor manufacturers, when they're using the external power brick, don't make the cable coming from the power brick long enough. So if you want to sit the power supply unit on the ground and have your monitor elevated on your desk, then that little cable with the barrel plug at the end very often isn't long enough for people's what I would class as like a normal desk setup, which is very frustrating because then you have to find somewhere to put that brick up on your desk. Not great. So I tend to prefer the flexibility that the normal, I don't know what you call it, kettle plug will offer you. So I certainly prefer that for my setup. I do get though that sometimes the power supply will die in your monitor. So if you've got an external power supply, then you can easily replace that without having to replace the entire monitor. But I think by the time the power supply is crapping out on you in your monitor, it's probably time to buy a new monitor anyway. I would certainly be expecting for most monitors that a power supply would last you, over 5 years. Now that's not always the case. There are dud units out there where power supplies blow up sooner than that. So again, it's just one of those considerations. Like there's no right answer here as to which method of doing things is better. Certainly if manufacturers were making power supplies with much longer cables on it, then I think that would be the ideal scenario. But yeah, the internal power supply is also a bit of a more convenient setup. So again, it can go either way. All right, next question is a bit of a long one, so bear with me here while I read this out. So it says, so every monitor review I see has the fastest overdrive mode overshoot crazy to where it is really unusable. I know the marketing of 1 millisecond, but any gamer will realize although it is technically true, in reality it is false. Why don't they make the fast mode just a little bit faster that improves cumulative deviation? It may only be used for the max refresh rate, but at least it would be usable. Just doesn't make sense. I don't get it, stuff like that. Do they even test these monitors for refresh rate and overshoot, or do they just check response time and call it a day? I feel if they worked with you or someone else who does extensive monitor reviews to build a monitor, I feel they could make a way better product where they can get the best case. Say, for example, he's using M27Q as an example, where we've got, say, a cumulative deviation of 489. They could have made that top end mode a little bit faster instead of going for the 1 millisecond response time. So yeah, it's an interesting question, this one. I think there's a couple of different considerations that monitor manufacturers have to make when they're choosing and tuning their overdrive settings. One of them is obviously the marketing aspect. So I know while it doesn't make sense to us looking at monitors and being like, why would you do this? You're kind of ruining the performance. The marketing aspect is very important. So while I personally think it's deceptive and manufacturers are bordering on lying to consumers by doing it, there's obviously that incentive for them to do it. So that's why they do it. I, of course, would prefer that they didn't, but unfortunately, that's just the reality of marketing these days, and it's kind of cheating a little bit with those things. I guess the second question there is, like, why don't they then just make in between, say, the balanced mode and the fast mode, the fastest mode in the monitor? Why don't they give you more options? I certainly think there's reason that they should be giving you more options. For example, monitors perform differently in different ambient temperatures. So for people who are using monitors in a warmer environment versus in a cooler environment, you're going to get some big differences in performance if you've only got one usable mode. So if you've got one bounce mode that is really good in 21 degree ambient temperature like we test, it may perform quite a bit faster and have more overshoot if you're in 30 degree ambient temperatures, and then quite a bit slower if you're in 10 degree ambient temperatures. Not that I hope many people are gaming in 10 10-degree rooms, but I guess it may be possible. So really for these things, I think the best option for monitor manufacturers is to include a user adjustable overdrive setting in addition to the, I guess, maybe pre-optimized modes. So you could have 3 or 4 different overdrive settings and then just a slider from like 0 to 100 that could allow further fine-tuning of the overdrive controls, which would then benefit people who are operating in all sorts of different ambient temperatures. But again, that's a complicated feature to integrate. Including more overdrive modes may require more space, memory physically on the monitor for the scaler to store all the different lookup tables and those sorts of things. So again, it really depends on the hardware. I think the reason why we see not very many overdrive settings is partly because of the memory limitations that monitors have. We're not talking about gigabytes of RAM here or gigabytes of storage here. And also that optimizing each overdrive setting is difficult and is time consuming. So monitor manufacturers want to spend the least amount of engineering effort on monitors, so they're going to minimize the amount of optimization that they do, which of course, again, I'd prefer more effort put in, especially for high-end products, but that's just the way it is. And then thirdly, I think on top of that, they kind of see that, a lot of the time it is just about marketing, so we can kind of get away with 1 or 2 overdrive settings and call it a day. Like the usable mode, that means people don't complain about the monitor, the off mode, which requires no effort, and then the fast sort of cheat mode for marketing reasons. And yeah, so I guess there's a whole bunch of reasons there as to why they may go about this. They could choose to optimize a little bit better, try and improve cumulative deviation, but that would require so many more modes. You'd have to optimize it for different temperatures and those sorts of things. So it is very challenging. I don't think it's as simple as just tuning one knob and hoping for the best. There's a lot of considerations there as to why they don't do these things. But obviously I would like to see, as more monitors get released and there's more competition, that people start taking overdrive tuning seriously, and especially including things like variable overdrive, which I do think makes a big difference to monitor performance, and I would personally prefer that over more overdrive settings if I had the choice. Tim, have you been enjoying using the Alienware QD-OLED for productivity tasks, or has it just been exclusively a gaming monitor for you? Any burn-in concerns after using it for a few months? So for me, it's been hard to use it too much as a gaming monitor because I haven't been doing a whole ton of gaming. I've been working a lot on building the new studio for Hardware Unboxed and Monitors Unboxed here at my, this is my old place at the moment, but my new place has got a new studio that I'm working on. So I haven't done a lot of gaming on the Alienware QD-OLED lately, and I've been sticking to my standard IPS for productivity tasks. I don't really see myself using it too much for productivity, although I've seen some big steps forward for improving the text clarity through some custom Windows utilities that hopefully I'll be looking at in maybe a video on this channel coming up soon. So I want to check those out to see how it'll go. But certainly as far as my personal usage of it so far, I haven't seen any burn-in with it. But again, I've been only using it for gaming and content and that sort of thing. So I wouldn't expect it to burn in under those conditions. So I'll be keeping an eye out for what other users are seeing in terms of burn-in. People who are more likely to use it for productivity, I'll probably just check in and see how it's going for those users. But yeah, once I get a more established gaming setup in the new studio space, then yeah, that'll be more usable, and I'll be using it more often, and we'll see how it goes. All right, so I'm going to hit pause on this Q&A session here. I've actually filmed quite a lot more questions than what you've seen just now, but I've just looked over at my recorder, and it turns out I've been recording for over an hour of questions and answers. So quite a lot of content, many more questions than I was scrolling through that I wanted to answer than I was expecting. So thanks to everyone who's been submitting lots of great questions to answer in this particular Q&A session. But it does mean that we will have, I guess, a part 1 and a part 2, which is great for the Monitors Unboxed channel. So I'll be back probably next week where I'll put up the second part of the questions that you guys can look through and get some hopefully useful answers to some of the things that you've been asking. So yeah, I guess that's it for this one. If you're interested in supporting the channel, then we've got our Patreon and Float Plane, links in the description below. It does support us buying monitors that we review on this channel and over on Hardware Unboxed as well. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.